Hey guys, alright, today gonna be watching How the US Failed in Vietnam, animated history by Armchair Historian. Well, the term fail, yes and no. If we look at it on the map, it looks like the United States winning the war by the time that they are leaving. Just because of what was technically US controlled. However, because of the way that the Northern Vietnamese and the Viet Cong fought the war, the reality is different. Because of their guerrilla tactics, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also if we look at it then closer in on the scale, like the political spectrum, the politics of the region of Vietnam, it is certainly an absolute failure for the United States. The person that they chose to back in South Vietnam, absolutely awful choice. They attempted to make, I believe, the same kind of decision that they did in South Korea. Originally, they did not back pro-democracy governments to stop communism or to attempt to stop communism. They would back anti-communist parties, so that could be anyone on the political spectrum as long as you were not a freaking commie. So they backed pretty much a dictator in South Vietnam to contain communism. They did the same pretty much in South Korea, I believe, at the start. South Korea, honestly, South and North Korea, their economies were pretty similar at the start. It wasn't until, honestly, within the last 40 to 50 years where the South Korean economy started to change and become a world global tech leader, right? But the U.S. failure in Vietnam is different because, well, there wasn't global outrage against the actions of the North Vietnamese, right? The North Koreans, on the other hand, did start the war. They did invade. Right. There was a bunch of other political issues at hand when the Korean War started that the Vietnam War did not have, which is why the United States would pretty much. Now, of course, there would be other countries involved, right? But it would not be seen in the same light as the Korean War for various reasons that I'm not too clear on. So just going to leave it at that because I don't want to say too much and get some of it wrong because I'm certain that will happen if I try and talk too much on the causes of the Vietnamese War and the differences it has against the Korean War because not my time field. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and look at Armchair Historian's reasoning behind how the U.S. failed.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair
Hi,
Historian.
Griffin Johnson.
Today's episode, How America's Mission in Vietnam Failed. This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that later.
Trees are speaking. Oh, napalm. Agent Orange, right? Yeah, it was Agent Orange. I think it was Agent Orange. I had to write a paper on that last semester.
And everywhere else. The Vietnam conflict is one of the most controversial chapters in U.S. history and helped define an entire generation. Its enduring notoriety can be traced to a number of factors. These included unprecedented media coverage and widespread distrust of the American.
Yes, another thing why it failed is, unlike Korea, it had a huge amount of news coverage. Now, we don't really get that news coverage for the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, do we? I wonder why.
American government. To help understand this watershed moment, we're asking the question of how a global superpower suffered such a humiliating defeat. Before we talk about America's defeat in Vietnam, we'll have to talk about Vietnam under French rule, which started in the latter half of the 19th century. since Europeans are just so great at listening to native people and respect.
Yeah. So yeah, the French rule over Vietnam also though was exceptionally cruel. They were very oppressive over the Vietnamese people. At least, now I wouldn't say they were as. I don't think they took it really to the extremes that the Belgians did in the Congo, where they sliced off hands for rubber, pretty much. But they were still really cruel. They were very oppressive. I don't want to talk too much because I don't want to say things wrong. Because it is very important, obviously, to Vietnamese and, well, just this area's history, right? The colonialism that occurred in their country. So, just gonna leave it at that.
Respecting their pre-existing geographic borders, they decided to call this region, which includes modern-day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, Indochina. Presumably because it's sandwiched between India and China, it was all very subtle and creative.
Yes.
France quickly and decisively
Europeans, excellent at naming names.
established themselves in this region, quelling any uprisings and forcing local rulers to cooperate with French colonial administrators.
Yep.
But this changed during the Second World War. In 1940, France was occupied by Germany, leaving their colonial territory largely undefended, and Japan was quick to seize this opportunity. Some initially saw the Japanese as Asian liberators, but were quickly disillusioned by the sheer brutality of the new regime.
Yes.
And nationalist sentiments began to sweep the nation, calling for self-governance.
So there was also though this growing desire for self-governance before the Japanese arrived. It had been building for decades by this point, and the French were having some issues with putting it down. It was just growing and growing, as was pretty much growing throughout all of Southeast Asia during this time period. And then when the Japanese come in, because Japan is not really the focus of the Allied powers, and certainly is not the focus of France, because France lost their homeland, so that is what they're more worried about fighting for. They don't care about their colonial territories outside of the North African territories, because, well, that's where fighting against Italy and Germany is happening. But what would happen in Indochina here under Japanese rule is that it would be the locals that ended up fighting for their freedom. They would spend most of the war, the next 5 years of the war, fighting for their independence and freedom, only to then at the end of the war get put back under the control of the French. And then that's how you got that Vietnamese civil war against the French in the 1950s, I believe. I think that's when it started, or it started in the late 40s. Once the Allies had secured
victory in 1945, the French returned to Indochina, and everyone was just so happy to see them.
Yeah.
Especially the Vietnam Independence League, where Viet
Okay,
Minh,
1946
this group
started.
of armed insurgents was led by the once exiled intellectual Ho Chi Minh, who was staunchly anti-colonialist. At this point, the United States was in a bind, as they once supported the Viet Minh against the Japanese during the Second World War. But French stability was seen as an important element in stopping communism from spreading into Southeast Asia.
I don't know if French stability, I don't know how stable they would be. You know, they got their asses handed to them in that last war. And they've never had too good of control over Vietnam throughout the time that they have been there. So, I don't know if it's really stable.
And Minh's anti-colonialist stance was something decidedly Bolshevik in influence. Despite French calls for support during the 1940s and 50s, the United States ultimately decided not to send troops to Vietnam.
In the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, 20,000 French were defeated decisively by 64,000 Viet Minh fighters, ending French involvement in
By
Indochina.
1954, France had completely pulled out of Indochina after 7 long years of bloodshed, splitting the area between communist-aligned North Vietnam and an unpopular and generally corrupt Western-aligned South Vietnam.
Yep.
But peace wouldn't last long. In 1955, fighting continued, but this time between North and South. President Kennedy, like Eisenhower, was hesitant to put boots on the ground in Vietnam after the humiliating defeat of France. But after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, seeing communism threaten the status quo in Asia,
Domino theory held that if communism gained a foothold in one country, it would quickly spread to surrounding countries in the region.
once more ramped up U.S. involvement after the late summer of 1964, when it was claimed that 2 U.S. ships that were aiding the South Vietnamese military came under attack by communist forces in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress soon gave President Johnson
This event was definitely staged. It was definitely staged.
the authority to send U.S. troops, and by early 1965,
The United States likes to stage their ships so that they can go to war, huh? Oh god, conspiracy theorists for Pearl Harbor are about to say something, maybe.
thousands were deployed. Now that we know why exactly America found itself in Vietnam, let's find out how it all went wrong. The American soldiers in Vietnam were fighting 2 enemies, whose battle tactics were well honed through years of combat against the French and Japanese. The first were southern insurgents called the Viet Cong, and the second were the more organized North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. The NVA was well supplied by the Soviet Union and China, and fought with aggressive guerrilla tactics that the US was in most ways unprepared for.
Which is weird to think about because, the United States Army got their start from being, guerrilla fighters against the British. And also, they would have had at this point, it's been about several decades, if not a century, since they really had their last real war against the Native Americans, or indigenous peoples of the Americas, who also fought with pretty guerrilla-like tactics. So it's kind of weird, though, how the United States, from World War I to Vietnam, did not have good tactics really to fight against guerrilla, when for the first 100 years of their history, they used guerrilla tactics and also had to fight an enemy that used hit-and-run guerrilla-like tactics. It's weird.
U.S. General William Westmoreland led the American Army in Vietnam and waged a strictly attrition-based defensive war. Westmoreland was known to have let politics dictate his decision-making process, as policymakers in Washington instead wanted statistics and numbers to show that they were winning. Success was measured
As they still do today with Afghanistan and Iraq.
by body counts, but counterintuitively, the more bombs that were dropped and the more people that were killed, the more support the North Vietnamese gained. The US was attempting to wage a conventional war, as they did in Korea, but the non-uniformed Viet Cong were highly mobile and unidentifiable, avoiding direct confrontations whenever they could, relying on ambushes, booby traps, and similar tactics to grind at US morale. The result of this strategy was that there were no actual front lines. While the Viet Cong frustrated US troops in the south, the NVA commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, also knew that a conventional war was impossible to win, and focused on winning over the people through an extensive propaganda network. He is quoted saying, "Do not fear the enemy, for they can only take your life. Fear the media far more, for they will destroy your honor." The Americans, meanwhile, believed that their attrition strategy was successful, and Westmoreland was predicting an imminent end of the war. But unbeknownst to him, Vietnamese forces were effectively using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to move large amounts of supplies through neutral Laos, despite being bombed almost every hour. By 1968, the US illusion of imminent victory was shattered by the Tet Offensive. The brutal campaign saw over 80,000 NVA and Viet Cong troops attack more than 100 cities throughout the country.
Yeah, the Tet Offensive, I believe, was also, though, kind of unsuccessful. It was, I believe, a lot of casualties for the North Vietnamese side and the Viet Cong side. And I don't think they really took too many cities. Because the Americans were still able to hold on to some pretty strategic points. But what it did definitely show, not only the American soldiers, but also the American media that would cover it, it certainly showed that, hey, you can bomb the crap out of them, they're still gonna fight. And if you were to even beat the NVA and get them to agree to the South becoming full controller over all of Vietnam, what you're instead going to have now is you're going to be constantly fighting uprisings and just a pure, just still decades more of guerrilla warfare. So this really kind of just showing the Americans, I mean, from the start, the Americans had no business in Vietnam, but it's really showing even now, like, hey, we shouldn't be here.
Including the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. Much of the fighting, such as in Hue, became the war's bloodiest battles. Despite launching such an ambitious attack, the NVA made few, if any, tangible gains, but it struck a devastating blow.
It's important to note that in almost every conventional battle, U.S. forces won. This is, yes, but we also have to, I think, there should be an explanation of what you're considering a conventional battle, and also when you make note of conventional battles, to see the other side, I still also would like to know what also is that number on the, I guess, unconventional side, the ambushes and stuff. How did Americans generally, how capable were they in handling ambushes and stuff? I would like to know that number.
Not only back in the United States, but also in the field. At home, the leaking of the Pentagon Papers also dispelled any justifications for the war and revealed atrocities such as the My Lai massacre, further increasing an anti-war sentiment across the country. And a so-called credibility gap began to grow between what the public was told and what they believed. As William Westmoreland himself would later say, "It's the first war we've ever fought on the television screen, and the first war that our country ever fought where the media had full reign." The casualties suffered in the war were now seen in a new light, with so many men having been lost thus far on the other side of the world, and they weren't even winning, while the NVA could strike at any time. Faced with a crushingly negative public opinion, the American government was forced to withdraw the nation's forces in 1973, and 2 years later, the NVA finally captured Saigon, ending the conflict. Now a word from our sponsor.
Alright, let's go to this final clip here of 1973. Yeah, I do agree with pretty much all of Armchair Historian's points here. Obviously this is a 7-minute video, so obviously he cannot go too in depth. But he did do a great job here with the research and presenting the information that he could in such a short time span. That was really well done. So yeah, the war in Vietnam. There are a lot of similarities of Vietnam and how the American government handled the information of Vietnam and how the American government is handling the information about the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. Even though they're not really wars, because the United States never sent proper declarations of war and actually has not sent proper issues of declarations of war since World War II. And instead, every single war since has just been the use of the president's authority as commander-in-chief, I believe. And the Senate and Congress just approving the president to use the troops like that or something like that. It's weird, it doesn't make sense, and it's stupid, and frankly, it also should not be happening. Because it is a growing, it's expanding the power of the executive branch and kind of, messing with the balance of power. Anyways, that's a rant for some other day. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to leave a like down below for what you want to see me leave a like down below for what you want to see. leave a like down below, and remember to comment a suggestion for what you want to see me react to next. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.